tin cup trembled in his hands, not from fear, but from the cold that had settled into his bones during 3 days in the frozen trench. Steam rose from the dark liquid inside, curling upward like the souls he imagined leaving the broken earth around him. Corporal James Whitmore had learned that on a battlefield, a cup of tea wasn't just a drink. It was proof you were still alive, proof you still had hands that could grip something, proof you could still taste something other than mud and cordani. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day. And if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The date was November 14th, 1917, and the Western Front had become a place where the definition of humanity had been reduced to its most basic elements. Could you still make a fire? Could you still boil water? Could you still remember why something as simple as tea mattered? James had joined the British Expeditionary Force 2 years earlier, a fresh-faced 20-year-old from Lancashire who believed in king and country and the righteousness of the cause. Now, at 22, he looked 40. His eyes had seen things that no training manual had prepared him for, things that made sleep a negotiation with nightmares rather than rest. The trench system where his battalion currently held position stretched for miles in either direction, a scar across the Belgian countryside that twisted and turned like the intestines of some great beast. These weren't the neat, straight lines that the newspapers back home depicted. These were chaotic mazes of mud and timber, sandbags and corrugated iron, places where men lived like rats and died like insects. The particular section James occupied with his platoon had been designated Sector 7C on the maps the officers studied, but the men called it the Devil's Cradle because it rocked with artillery fire day and night. The tea in his cup had come from a care package his mother had sent 6 weeks ago. The tin had survived the journey from England to France, then from the depot to the forward positions, passed from truck to wagon to bearer, until it finally reached his shaking hands. Inside that battered tin had been not just tea leaves, but a letter written in his mother's careful script, each word formed with such precision that he could picture her at the kitchen table, dipping the pen, choosing her phrases carefully to avoid saying anything that might worry him or that the censors might strike out. She wrote about the weather in Lancashire, about Mrs. Henderson's son who had returned home missing an arm, but grateful to be breathing, about the garden and how the carrots had come in well despite the late frost. James had read that letter 17 times. He had memorized every word. He kept it folded in his breast pocket, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the moisture that permeated everything in the trenches. Sometimes during the worst bombardments, when the earth shook and men pressed themselves into the mud and prayed to gods they had stopped believing in. Months ago he would press his hand against that pocket and feel the letter there. It was a talisman. It was proof that somewhere a world existed where people worried about carrots and frost instead of shrapnel and gas. The tea itself was a luxury beyond measure. In the trenches, luxuries were defined differently than they had been in civilian life. A luxury wasn't a fine meal or a soft bed. A luxury was dry socks. A luxury was a letter from home. A luxury was 10 minutes without the sound of artillery. A luxury was tea that actually tasted like tea rather than the bitter, over-stewed substance that the army provided boiled in the same containers they used for everything else, carrying the metallic tang of canteen water and the ghost flavors of 1,000 previous meals. James had been careful with his mother's tea. He rationed it like a miser hoarding gold, 1 pinch per cup, no more. He made it last. This cup he held now, warming his frozen fingers, was the final serving. The tin was empty. After this, he would return to army tea, or whatever substitute could be scrounged from the quartermaster's stores. But for this moment, this singular moment in the cold November morning, he had real tea. He had a connection to home. He had proof that somewhere beyond the barbed wire and the mud and the endless thunder of guns, ordinary life continued. The routine of making tea had become a ritual that anchored him. First, the careful rationing of fuel. Wood was scarce, coal even more so. The men scavenged whatever they could find. Broken ammunition crates, shattered wagon wheels, once memorably a mahogany chair from some abandoned farmhouse, its carved legs and velvet cushion grotesquely out of place in the trench, until someone took an axe to it and fed it to the fire piece by piece. The fire itself had to be managed carefully. Too much smoke would draw attention from enemy observers. Too much light would make them a target for snipers. The men had learned to build small, efficient fires in hollowed-out sections of the trench, using metal braziers salvaged from destroyed buildings or fashioned from old oil drums. Water came from various sources, none of them particularly clean. Sometimes it was pumped from wells behind the lines and brought forward in containers. Sometimes it was collected from shell holes, boiled thoroughly to kill whatever microscopic horrors lurked in water that had sat in a crater surrounded by decomposing matter. Sometimes when they were lucky, it rained, and they could catch relatively fresh water in their tin cups and helmets. The water James had used for this final cup of his mother's tea had come from a supply run the previous evening carried forward by a rotation of men who risked sniper fire and random artillery to bring up rations and water and ammunition. The act of boiling water, of measuring out the precious tea leaves, of waiting for the brew to steep properly, these were acts of defiance against the chaos. They were statements that even here, even in this place where civilization had broken down and men killed each other over strips of mud, there were still standards. There were still rituals. There were still moments when you could close your eyes and pretend, just for an instant, that you were somewhere else, that you were human. James lifted the cup to his lips and inhaled the steam. The scent was extraordinary. It carried him back across the miles and the months to his mother's kitchen. He could see the blue and white china teapot she always used. He could see the mismatched cups and saucers, accumulated over years, each one with its own small chip or crack, each one with its own history. He could see his father sitting at the table, reading the newspaper, commenting on the war news with the certainty of someone who had never heard a shell scream overhead. He could see his younger sister Mary, now working in a munitions factory, who used to complain about having to drink tea when she wanted lemonade. The first sip was transcendent. The warmth spread through him like a benediction. The flavor was clean and strong and utterly familiar. For 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15 seconds, the war disappeared. There was only the tea. There was only the connection to everything he had left behind. There was only the memory of being someone other than Corporal James Whitmore of His Majesty. There's Armed Forces, serial number 372498, currently occupying a hole in the ground in Belgium and waiting for orders that would likely send him over the top into machine gun fire. Then reality returned, as it always did. The taste of tea gave way to the smell of the trench, unwashed bodies, latrine buckets, the sweet, sickly odor of decay that no amount of lime could completely mask, the lingering chemical taint of gas that had been used 3 days prior, far enough away that they had escaped with only burning eyes and rasping throats, but close enough that they could still smell it when the wind shifted. The musty scent of wet sandbags and rotting timber. The metallic smell of blood and cordite that seemed to have soaked into the earth itself. Around him the trench was coming awake. Men emerged from dugouts and funk holes, stretching cramped muscles, coughing, spitting, performing the small morning rituals that marked another day survived. Private Tommy Fletcher appeared from around a traverse, his young face gray with exhaustion. He had been on sentry duty during the night, 2 hours of staring into the darkness, watching for any sign of enemy movement, listening for the sound of wire being cut or the whisper of approaching raiders. His eyes were bloodshot and his hands shook slightly as he lit a cigarette with hands cupped against the wind. "Morning, Corp," Tommy said, his voice hoarse. "Quiet night, mostly. Few flares around 3. Some movement in their line around 4, but nothing came of it. James nodded. Tommy was 18 years old. He had lied about his age to enlist, claiming to be 19, and even that had been barely legal. Now he looked ancient. They all did. The war aged you in ways that had nothing to do with calendar years. You could see it in the eyes. The young men who arrived fresh from England still had clear eyes, bright with excitement or fear or determination. The men who had been here for months, who had survived multiple tours in the line, had different eyes. Hollowed out, watchful, eyes that had seen too much and expected nothing good. "Get some sleep, lad," James told him. "I'll take over the watch." Tommy didn't argue. He disappeared into one of the dugouts, a shallow cave carved into the trench wall and reinforced with timber. Within minutes, James could hear him snoring, the deep, exhausted sleep of someone who had pushed past tiredness into a realm where the body simply shut down. James finished his tea slowly, savoring each remaining sip. When the cup was empty, he rinsed it carefully with a little water from his canteen, then tucked it into his pack. The tin that had held the tea went into his pocket. He couldn't bring himself to throw it away. It had traveled so far. It meant too much. The morning routine continued around him. Sergeant Morrison emerged from the officer's dugout, where he had been receiving the day's orders. Morrison was a career soldier, a man who had joined the army before the war and who would likely remain in the army after it ended if he survived. He had the particular kind of authority that came not from rank alone, but from experience. Men followed Morrison because he knew what he was doing, because he had kept them alive through situations where death had seemed certain, because he didn't waste lives unnecessarily. "Right then," Morrison called out, his voice carrying along the trench. "We've got work parties needed. Repairs to the traverse section near the SAP, reinforcing the parapet where last night's shelling damaged it, and we need a burial detail. Jerry's been in the sun too long over in no man's land near Sector 6. No one complained. There were no good jobs in the trenches, only different types of difficult, dangerous, or unpleasant work. The men sorted themselves into groups with the efficiency of long practice. James found himself assigned to the repair party, which suited him. Physical work helped pass the time. It kept you warm. It kept your mind occupied with immediate tasks rather than dwelling on larger fears. The work took them out into no man's land during the precious hours of morning mist, when visibility was poor enough that they could risk exposure without being immediately targeted by snipers. They crawled through gaps in their own wire, dragging materials with them, moving slowly and carefully to avoid making noise that would alert the enemy to their presence. The ground between the lines was a nightmare landscape of shell holes and debris. Shattered trees stood like broken teeth. Unexploded shells jutted from the mud at crazy angles. The bodies of men from both sides lay scattered in various states of decay, some recent enough to still be recognizable as human, others reduced to scattered bones and scraps of uniform. James and 3 other men worked on reinforcing a section of trench wall that had been damaged by artillery fire. They filled sandbags with the omnipresent mud, passed them up, stacked them carefully to create a new parapet. The work was hard and monotonous. Fill a bag, tie it off, pass it up, fill another bag. The mud was heavy and cold, and it seemed to fight them, clinging to their shovels, soaking through their gloves, working its way into every crease and seam of their uniforms. As they worked, James found his mind wandering back to the tea. It had been such a small thing, a cup of tea, 10 minutes of warmth and flavor and connection, yet it had meant everything. It had reminded him that he was more than just a soldier, more than just a body occupying a uniform, more than just another name on a roster waiting to become a casualty report. He was James Whitmore. He had a mother who loved him. He had a home. He had a life that existed outside of this mud and wire and death. The philosophical question that haunted him was this: how did you hold on to your humanity in a place designed to strip it away? How did you remember that the men across no man's land, the ones trying to kill you, were also human? How did you reconcile the fact that you could share tea with your mates in the morning and then be ordered to fix bayonets, and charge into enemy trenches in the afternoon to kill or be killed, to do violence that would have been unthinkable in any other context. Some men coped by dehumanizing the enemy. They used slurs and epithets, reducing the Germans to caricatures, to objects rather than people. It made it easier to kill them. James understood the psychology, but he couldn't quite manage it himself. He had been in enough raids, had fought in enough hand-to-hand encounters in captured trenches to know that the men on the other side were fundamentally no different from himself. They were cold. They were scared. They missed their homes. They wanted the war to end. They made tea when they could and treasured letters from their families and tried to hold on to their humanity in exactly the same ways. Private Daniels, working beside James filling sandbags, suddenly spoke. "What do you reckon it's like for them, Corp? I mean, do you think they're over there having their breakfast same as us? Having a brew, moaning about the mud, counting the days?" It was the kind of question men asked when the philosophy of their situation became too heavy to carry alone. James considered his answer carefully. "I expect they are, Danny. I expect they're exactly the same as us. Different uniforms, different language, but otherwise the same. Makes you think, doesn't it? I mean, none of us asked for this. Not really. We all just sort of ended up here doing what we were told. And now we're supposed to kill each other over what exactly? I can't even remember anymore what we're fighting about." Daniels was young, younger even than Tommy Fletcher. He had arrived at the front 3 months ago, part of a replacement draft sent to bring the battalion back up to strength after heavy losses during the previous summer's offensive. He still asked questions that veteran soldiers had long since stopped asking, because the answers either didn't exist or didn't help. "We're fighting because we're soldiers, and those are our orders," James replied. It was the safe answer, the practical answer. But then he added more quietly, "And we're fighting to get home. Every day we survive is one day closer to the end of this. Keep your head down, do your job, look after your mates, and maybe we all make it back to England." They worked in silence after that, the only sounds being the squelch of mud, the rustle of sandbags, and the distant rumble of artillery from other sectors of the line. The morning mist began to lift, revealing the wasteland around them in greater detail. James could see the German trenches across the way, perhaps 300 yards distant. Somewhere over there, German soldiers were doing exactly what they were doing, repairing damage, filling sandbags, trying to stay alive. By mid-morning, the repair work was complete, and the detail made its way back to their own trenches, crawling carefully through the wire. James was exhausted in the way that had become normal, a bone-deep tiredness that never quite went away because sleep in the trenches was always interrupted, always inadequate, always haunted. But there was satisfaction in having completed the task, in having built something even if it was just a pile of sandbags that would likely be destroyed by the next barrage. Back in the trench, he found a relatively dry spot and sat down with his back against the wall. Around him, the daily life of the trench continued. Men cleaned weapons, wrote letters home, played cards with decks so worn that the suits and numbers were barely visible, told jokes that weren't particularly funny but served to pass the time and maintain morale. The smell of cooking wafted from a nearby traverse, where someone was heating up tins of bully beef and attempting to make them palatable through the addition of salvaged vegetables and whatever spices could be scrounged. Lieutenant Ashford appeared, making his rounds of the positions. Ashford was new, arrived 2 weeks ago to replace Lieutenant Pemberton, who had been killed by a sniper. Fresh from training school, full of book knowledge about warfare, but desperately short on practical experience. To his credit, he listened to the sergeants and corporals, understanding that they knew more about survival than he did. James respected that. Some officers arrived convinced that their rank and education made them automatically superior, and they tended to get themselves and their men killed quickly. Ashford was learning. "Corporal Whitmore," Ashford said, approaching. "The sergeant tells me you've been in the line for 11 weeks straight. That's more than the usual rotation." "Yes, sir. We're short on experienced NCOs. I volunteered to stay on rather than be rotated back." It wasn't entirely true. The Army's rotation system had broken down due to casualty rates and the constant demand for men at the front. But James had indeed volunteered to remain, partly because the men in his section trusted him, and he didn't want them stuck with some inexperienced corporal who might get them killed, and partly because going back to the rear areas meant dealing with the rigid discipline and pointless drills that seemed even more absurd once you had experienced actual combat. "Well, I appreciate your dedication," Ashford said, "but everyone needs rest. I'm putting you on the list for the next rotation back. That's an order, Corporal, not a request." James nodded. There was no point arguing with an officer who had made up his mind. "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." After Ashford moved on, Sergeant Morrison appeared and sat down beside James. "He's not wrong, you know. You need a break. You're starting to look like a ghost." "I feel like a ghost sometimes," James admitted. "Like I'm already dead and just haven't noticed yet." Morrison pulled out a cigarette and lit it, then offered one to James, who accepted. They smoked in companionable silence for a moment before Morrison spoke again. "You know what I miss most? Proper tea. Real tea, like my wife used to make. Not this swill they give us here. Proper Yorkshire tea in a proper pot with proper milk and 2 sugars. I had proper tea this morning," James said. "Last of what my mum sent. It was..." He struggled to find words. "It was like being home for 5 minutes." "That's the thing that'll keep you sane," Morrison said. "Remembering there's a world outside of this. Remembering what we're going back to. Some of the lads, especially the young ones, they start to forget. They start to think this is normal. This is life. That's when you lose them, even if they don't get shot. You lose them up here." He tapped his head. James understood exactly what Morrison meant. He had seen it happen. Men who stopped writing letters home. Men who stopped taking care of themselves. Men who developed the 1,000-yard stare. Looking through things rather than at them. Men who volunteered for the most dangerous assignments, not out of bravery, but out of a kind of fatalistic despair. Men who died inside long before their bodies caught up. "I won't forget," James promised. "I've got too much to go back to." "Good man, keep hold of that." The conversation was interrupted by the sudden whistle of incoming shells. Everyone reacted instantly, pressing themselves against the trench walls, ducking low, covering their heads. The shells impacted in no man's land, throwing up great fountains of earth and mud. It was a ranging shot, the Germans testing their artillery, making sure they had the coordinates correct for whatever they were planning. More shells followed, creeping closer to the British lines. One landed directly in front of their position. The explosion so close that the concussion felt like being punched in the chest, the noise so loud that it momentarily deafened everyone nearby. Then, as suddenly as it started, the barrage stopped. Silence fell, broken only by the ringing in their ears and the sound of falling debris. Men slowly raised their heads, checking themselves and each other for injuries. Miraculously, no one in James's section had been hit, though everyone was covered in fresh mud thrown up by the explosions. "They're feeling frisky today," Morrison commented, spitting out dirt, "probably softening us up for something tonight." He was right, of course. Artillery barrages were often followed by raids, small-scale attacks designed to capture prisoners for interrogation, to test defenses, to keep the enemy nervous and off balance. James felt the familiar tightening in his stomach, the knowledge that the relative quiet of the morning was about to end, that the night would bring violence and chaos. The afternoon passed in tense anticipation. Orders came down to strengthen the watch, to ensure weapons were clean and ready, to prepare for a possible enemy raid. The men went about their preparations with grim efficiency. Ammunition was distributed. Grenades were placed in easy reach. The wire in front of the trenches was checked and reinforced where necessary. Sentries were doubled. Everyone knew the drill. As evening approached, James found himself thinking about tea again, about the ritual of it, about the normalcy it represented. In a few hours, he might be fighting for his life in the darkness, using his bayonet, his rifle, his bare hands if necessary. But right now, in this moment, he wanted to think about tea, about his mother's kitchen, about sitting at a table with a cup and saucer instead of a battered tin cup, about conversations that didn't revolve around kill zones and barrage schedules and casualty reports. He pulled out a scrap of paper and a pencil from his pack. Writing letters in the trenches was difficult. The paper got damp. The pencils broke. Your hands were often too cold or too shaky to write legibly. But he wanted to write to his mother. He wanted to tell her that her tea had arrived, that it had been perfect, that it had meant more to him than she could possibly know. "Dear Mum," he wrote. The words came slowly, each one carefully chosen. "I received your package, and I cannot thank you enough. The tea was magnificent. I saved it for special occasions, and this morning I had the last cup. For those few minutes I was home again, sitting at your table, listening to you and Dad talk about the garden and the neighbors. I could almost smell you cooking, almost hear Mary laughing. Thank you for that gift. Thank you for reminding me what I'm fighting to get back to." He wanted to tell her more. He wanted to tell her about the cold and the mud and the fear. He wanted to tell her that he was tired in ways that sleep couldn't fix. He wanted to tell her that he had seen things that would give him nightmares for the rest of his life, however long or short that might be. But he couldn't write those things. The censors would strike them out. More importantly, he didn't want to worry her. She had enough to worry about already. Instead, he wrote about small things, about Tommy Fletcher, who reminded him of the apprentices at his old job, about Sergeant Morrison, who looked after the men like a shepherd with his flock, about the weather and how he hoped it wouldn't rain tonight, about how he was being rotated back to the rear soon for some rest, about how much he was looking forward to coming home when this was all over. He signed the letter, folded it carefully and tucked it into his pocket. He would give it to the mail orderly when the man came through later. With luck, it would reach England within a week or two, and his mother would read it and know that he was all right, or at least alive, which in this war was sometimes the best you could hope for. Darkness fell. The temperature dropped. Frost began to form on the sandbags and the exposed metal of weapons and equipment. James pulled his coat tighter and stamped his feet to maintain circulation. Around him the trench transformed. What had been merely uncomfortable during the day became actively hostile at night. The cold was worse. The darkness was complete except for occasional flares that cast everything in stark, jerky shadows. The sounds were different too. Every noise was amplified by the darkness. Every scrape, every whisper, every distant sound could be an approaching enemy. The raid came at midnight. It was heralded by a brief but intense artillery barrage that hammered their section of the line. Then silence. Then the sound of whistles from no man's land as the German raiders charged toward the British trenches. James and the others were ready. Rifles fired into the darkness. Machine guns opened up, their muzzle flashes lighting up the night. Flares were sent up, illuminating the battlefield in harsh white light that revealed the attackers sprinting across no man's land. The fighting was brutal and close. The Germans reached the trench in several places, jumping down among the defenders, using clubs and knives and pistols in the confined space where rifles were too unwieldy. James found himself face to face with a German soldier, both of them young, both of them terrified, both of them doing what they had been trained to do. There was no time to think, only to react. James's rifle came up. The bayonet caught the German in the chest, and the man fell. There was no triumph in it, no satisfaction, just the mechanical action of pulling the bayonet free and turning to face the next threat. The trench was chaos. Men grappled in the darkness. Grenades exploded. Someone was screaming. The sharp crack of pistol shots mixed with the deeper boom of rifles and the chatter of machine guns. Then, as suddenly as they had come, the Germans withdrew. Whistles blew and they pulled back, dragging some of their wounded with them, leaving others behind. The British didn't pursue. They had held their position, which was the objective. In the sudden quiet that followed, men checked themselves and each other for wounds. The butcher's bill was tallied: 3 dead, 7 wounded, 2 seriously enough that they would be evacuated to the rear. The German dead numbered 5 in the British trenches, with several more visible in no man's land who hadn't made it back. James sat down heavily, his hands shaking now that the immediate danger had passed. The adrenaline that had carried him through the fight was draining away, leaving behind exhaustion and something that might have been grief if he had let himself feel it fully. He had killed a man tonight, not his first time, but it never became easy, never became routine. Each time he pushed the reality of it down, locked it away in some mental compartment that he would have to deal with later, if there was a later. Sergeant Morrison appeared, checking on his men. "You all right, James?" "Yes, Sergeant, I'm fine." "Good lad. Get some rest if you can. We'll need to be sharp tomorrow." Jerry might try again, but James couldn't rest. His mind was too active, churning through the events of the day, from the peace of morning tea to the violence of midnight combat. The contrast was so extreme that it felt like two different worlds, two different realities that somehow coexisted in the same 24 hours. He thought about the German soldier he had killed. Had that man had tea this morning? Had he received packages from home? Did he have a mother somewhere in Germany who would receive a telegram in a few days informing her that her son was dead? These were dangerous thoughts. Thinking of the enemy as human beings just like yourself made it harder to do what needed to be done, but James couldn't help it. That was who he was. That was the humanity he was trying to preserve. Morning came eventually, as it always did. The gray light of dawn revealed the aftermath of the night's fighting. Repair parties went out to fix the damage. Burial details dealt with the dead. The wounded were carried back to the aid station. The machine of war ground onward, indifferent to individual suffering, indifferent to the small moments of humanity that men tried to preserve. James went through the motions of another day. Breakfast was tinned meat and hard biscuits and army tea that tasted like dishwater. He tried to imagine it was his mother's tea, tried to recapture that sense of connection, but it didn't work. The magic had been in the real thing, in the genuine article, not in imagination or substitutes. Lieutenant Ashford found him mid-morning. "Corporal Whitmore, you're being rotated out tonight, you and 5 others. Transport will pick you up at the rear positions at 2200 hours. Get your kit ready." Relief and guilt warred within him. Relief at the prospect of leaving the front line, of getting hot food and a real bed and relative safety. Guilt at abandoning his mates, even though he knew that was irrational, that everyone took their turn in rotation, that he had already stayed longer than required. He spent the day saying goodbyes to the men he had lived with, fought alongside, kept alive, and been kept alive by. To Tommy Fletcher, he gave advice about staying alert and keeping his head down. To Sergeant Morrison he gave respect and gratitude for everything the older man had taught him. To each of the others he gave whatever words seemed appropriate. They all understood. They would all take their own turn in rotation eventually, if they survived long enough. As night fell and the time came to leave, James took one last look at the trench that had been his home for 11 weeks. It was just a ditch in the ground, really. A scar in the earth filled with mud and misery. But it was also the place where he had learned who he really was, what he was capable of, what he could endure. It was the place where he had discovered that humanity could persist even in the most inhuman conditions, that small acts like sharing tea could matter more than grand gestures, that connection to home and family and ordinary life was what gave you the strength to face another day. He climbed out of the trench and made his way back through the communication trenches toward the rear areas, moving through the darkness with the other men being rotated out. Behind him the line held. Ahead of him temporary safety waited, and in his pocket the empty tea tin that had traveled from Lancashire to Belgium, that had contained his mother's love in the form of dried leaves, that had given him those precious minutes of normalcy in a world gone mad. The war would continue. Tomorrow other men would stand watch in that trench. Other raids would be fought. Other letters would be written and sent home. Other packages would arrive containing small treasures from a world that seemed increasingly distant and dreamlike. Other cups of tea would be brewed and consumed, each one a small defiance against the chaos, each one a reminder that beneath the uniforms and the violence and the horror they were still human beings who valued warmth and flavor and connection. James walked through the darkness, his breath visible in the cold air, his boots squelching in the mud, his rifle slung over his shoulder. In a few hours he would reach the rest area. He would sleep in a real bed. He would eat hot food. He would write more letters. He would rest and recover and prepare to return to the line, because that was what soldiers did. The war demanded it. Duty required it. But he would also remember this day, remember the transcendent experience of his mother's tea, remember that he was more than just a soldier, more than just a number, more than just another body in the trenches. He was James Whitmore. He was human. And as long as he could remember that, as long as he could hold on to the small moments of grace and connection that gave life meaning, he could survive whatever came next. The tea was gone, but what it represented remained. Home, family, love, the ordinary things that made life worth living, worth fighting for, worth surviving to return to. In the darkness behind him, the front line remained. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, new tests of endurance. But tonight, walking toward rest, James allowed himself to hope. Hope that he would see his mother's kitchen again. Hope that he would sit at that table and drink tea from those mismatched cups. Hope that this war would end, and all of them, British and German alike, could go home to the people who loved them. A cup of tea in the battlefield. Such a small thing. Such a temporary pleasure. But in that moment, in those few minutes of warmth and familiarity, it had been everything. It had been proof of life, proof of love, proof that somewhere beyond the wire and the mud and the thunder of guns, the ordinary world continued, waiting for those who survived to return to it. And that, James thought as he walked through the night, was worth fighting for. Not the grand political causes or the strategic objectives or the territorial gains, but the simple right to return home, to sit at a table to drink tea with the people you loved, to live an ordinary life in an ordinary world where the most important decision of the day was whether to have one sugar or two. The darkness swallowed him as he moved further from the front. Behind him, the war continued. Ahead of him, rest waited, and in his heart, carried more carefully than any physical burden, he held the memory of his mother's tea and everything it represented. That memory would sustain him through whatever came next. That memory was his armor against despair. That memory was his compass pointing toward home.